My brother walked into my gala like he built it. He didn't. I did. Every table, every name on that guest list, every deal that paid for this room mine. And I was standing in the back, holding a white envelope, watching him shake hands with my investors like he belonged there. He didn't know what was inside it. That was the point. There he was, Elijah Sterling, moving through the crowd with that same loose confidence he's carried since we were kids, like the space already owed him something. He laughed at something one of my senior partners said. He put a hand on someone's shoulder. He was working the room. My room. I didn't move. I just watched. The envelope was thick. I'd been carrying it for 3 days, waiting for exactly this moment. If you've ever been the one who did everything right and still got treated like you were invisible, stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't, because this story ends exactly where you think it should. The last time I saw Elijah before tonight, he was standing in our childhood living room, announcing his MBA acceptance to a room full of guests who had come for my 18th birthday. Nobody sang happy birthday that night. But before I tell you what's in that envelope, you need to know what happened 15 years ago. My name is Mason Sterling. I'm 33 years old. I run a technology company called Sterling Systems. We handle data infrastructure and cybersecurity for mid to large enterprises. We have clients in 11 states. We've been profitable every year since year 2. I built it from a single room I rented for $600 a month. Secondhand desk, one monitor, a space heater that tripped the circuit breaker twice a week in the winter. I didn't care. It was mine, and nothing in it had been handed to me. Nobody in my family helped me do that. Nobody offered. And honestly, by the time I started, I'd stopped expecting them to. That's not bitterness. That's just an accurate description of how things worked in the Sterling household. Growing up, there were 2 sons. Elijah, the older one, 4 years ahead of me, and me. Elijah got the birthday dinners, the congratulations texts, the long conversations about his future at the kitchen table that stretched past dessert while the plates sat there getting cold. He got our parents' full attention the way gravity works automatically, completely, without anyone deciding to. It was just the shape of things in that house. The way the light fell in that house, I got the leftovers. Not because my parents were cruel people. They weren't. They just never really saw me. And there's a particular kind of damage that comes not from being hated, but from being consistently looked past. You don't get angry about it right away. You just start quietly building your life around the assumption that no one is coming. And eventually, that assumption becomes a strategy. I learned that early. The first time I understood the full shape of it, really understood it, I was 15. I'd gotten the highest score in my class on a state math exam. Perfect score. I remember folding the certificate carefully on the bus ride home, smoothing the crease with my thumb, letting myself think maybe this time would be different. I walked in through the back door. My mom was on the phone with Elijah's guidance counselor because he'd failed his college entrance exam for the 2nd time. She looked up, saw me, and waved me toward the kitchen without pausing the call. My dad was in the living room with the TV on. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, certificate in hand, and then I just put it on the counter and went upstairs. It was still there 3 days later, exactly where I'd left it. Nobody moved it. Nobody mentioned it. Not once. I didn't throw a fit. I didn't cry. I folded the certificate, put it in my backpack, and made a decision that 15-year-olds probably shouldn't have to make. If I wanted anything recognized in this family, I was going to have to build something impossible to ignore. That decision turned out to be more useful than any of them could have imagined. The second time the shape of things became undeniable, I was 17, almost 18. I'd spent 2 months working after school, stocking shelves at a hardware store 3 nights a week to save up for a decent laptop. The kind I could write code on. I told my parents about it at dinner one night, not asking for anything, just sharing something I was proud of. My dad gave a small nod. My mom said, "That's nice, honey." And then, before I'd finished my sentence, she turned to Elijah and asked how his essay for a summer business program was coming along. The table moved on without me. I sat there another 10 minutes and finished my food in silence, the way I always did. I bought the laptop anyway. I taught myself to code on it, late at night after everyone was asleep, in a bedroom at the end of the hall that nobody ever knocked on unless something was needed from me. 3 years later, I used that machine to write the first version of the software that became Sterling Systems. Every line of code was paid for by hours in that hardware store that my family never once asked about. I didn't know yet how far that foundation would reach. I just knew I was the only one building it. But here's what I need you to understand before this story goes where it's going. I'm not telling you any of this for sympathy. I'm telling you because every detail from those years, every ignored certificate, every dinner table that moved on before I finished speaking, every time I was handed nothing and expected to be fine came back. All of it. As evidence. As motive. As the reason I kept careful records when nobody else thought to bother. That's the thing they never factored in. The invisible ones always do. I turned 18 on a Saturday in October. My parents had been planning the party for 3 weeks. I knew because my mom mentioned it at dinner one night, not to me specifically, just out loud to the room, the way she announced things. We're doing something nice for Mason's birthday. I remember thinking, this is different. Maybe they finally saw the gap. Maybe something had shifted. I should have known better. The house was full by 7:30, maybe 40 people, neighbors, family, friends, a few relatives I only saw at holidays. There were streamers, a banner, a sheet cake from the bakery my mom liked, white frosting, blue letters. Happy 18th, Mason. I stood in the living room and looked at my name on that cake and felt something loosen in my chest. Something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. It almost felt like it was mine. The first 2 hours were fine. People came up and said happy birthday. Someone pressed an envelope with $20 into my hand. I ate too much of the spinach dip because I was nervous and didn't know what else to do with my hands. Elijah was there, moving through the room the way he always did, easy and loud, absorbing attention without trying. But it was my night. I kept telling myself that. My night. Then Elijah clinked a fork against his glass. The room went quiet. I was standing near the kitchen doorway, plate in hand, watching him. He was at the center of the living room, jacket on, looking comfortable in the way that people look comfortable when they're about to say something they've been rehearsing. I know tonight is Mason's night, he said, and I don't want to take anything away from that. That sentence. Even now, I know exactly what it means when someone opens with that sentence. But I got some news this week that I have to share it with the people I love. He paused. Let the room lean in. I got accepted into the Hargrove MBA program. The room erupted. Applause. Someone let out a whoop. My dad crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed Elijah in a hug that lasted a long time. My mom had her hand over her mouth. People were laughing, congratulating, moving toward him like a current. I stood where I was. I watched my dad's face while he held Elijah. I'd seen that expression maybe twice in my life, that full, uncomplicated pride. It was a good expression. I just didn't know what it felt like aimed at me. The energy in the room never came back to me after that. Not fully. People drifted toward Elijah, toward the new thing, the exciting thing. The conversations restructured themselves around his news. Someone asked if the program was hard to get into. Someone else asked what his focus would be. My aunt asked if he'd need a new laptop. I put my plate down on the kitchen counter. The cake came out 20 minutes later. My mom carried it from the kitchen, candles lit, and set it on the dining table. The wax was already starting to drip by the time she got it positioned. A few people gathered, 6, maybe 7, in a house that had 40 people in it an hour earlier. Someone started to sing and then trailed off, I think, because they weren't sure if the moment had enough momentum behind it. The song limped through one verse. I blew out the candles. A couple people clapped, the kind of clap that ends quickly. Elijah was in the other room still talking about the MBA. Nobody said my name during the singing. I'm not sure anybody was paying close enough attention to notice. I cut the cake myself. I handed out pieces. I smiled when people looked at me. Later, maybe 11 o'clock, when most of the guests had left and my parents were cleaning up, I found my phone on the kitchen counter where I'd left it. I opened the family group chat. My mom had posted a photo Elijah, mid-laugh, my dad's arm around him, the living room lights warm behind them. Already 14 reactions, 3 laughing emojis from relatives, a string of congratulations. I scrolled down to see if anyone had posted anything from earlier in the night, any photo from the cake, any mention of the birthday. I scrolled slowly, the way you do when you're hoping the next thing you see will be different from what you expect. Nothing. Not a single word. I screenshotted the chat. I don't know exactly why I did it. I wasn't thinking about evidence or leverage or any of the things I'd think about later. I just wanted a record of what had happened. Something concrete. Something I could look at so that later, when my brain tried to smooth it over the way brains do, I'd have proof that I hadn't imagined it. I took the screenshot, put my phone in my pocket, and went to my room. I opened my laptop. The screen light was the only light in the room, and I started writing. Not a journal entry. Not a letter. I opened a blank document and started sketching the outline of a business. Something that had been sitting in the back of my head for months. Half-formed, waiting. I didn't have a name for it yet. I didn't have a plan. I just had a very clear understanding, for the first time, that nobody in that house was going to build anything for me, and that the only way forward was through. I wrote until 2 in the morning. The party noise faded out, slowly, voices, then a door, then nothing. The house went quiet. I kept writing. That was the night Sterling Systems began. 6 years passed. I'm not going to make those years sound romantic. They weren't. Building something real is mostly unglamorous. It's long nights staring at code that won't compile while you eat dinner over your keyboard. It's client calls that go nowhere, invoices that come back unpaid. A stretch of 6 weeks one winter where I had $11 in my personal checking account and I was too stubborn to tell anyone. It's the kind of 3 or 4 weeks where you genuinely wonder if you've made a catastrophic mistake, and there's no one to call because you built this thing alone, and asking for help from the people who were supposed to be your safety net stopped feeling like an option years ago. But it held. Sterling Systems held. By the time I was 24, we had our first 5 clients. Small companies, careful contracts, nothing flashy. I hired my first part-time contractor. I moved out of the rented room and into an actual office space, still small, still mine. I paid every bill on time. I kept every record. That habit from childhood, the one that started with a screenshot of a group chat that forgot my name, it had turned into a system. Organized folders, time-stamped everything. Every email, every contract, every version of every agreement. I didn't know yet why that mattered so much. I just knew that I never wanted to be in a position where I couldn't prove what had happened. That was the year I reconnected with Dylan Marsh. We'd gone to the same university, overlapping for 2 years before he graduated. He was 2 years older, studying computer systems, and he was the kind of person who made everything look easy without being obnoxious about it. We'd lost touch after he graduated, the way you do, different cities, different schedules. But he found me on LinkedIn, saw what I was building, and reached out. We got coffee. He asked good questions. Not the generic startup questions, not what's your exit strategy or have you thought about scaling. He asked about the specific problem I was solving, why existing solutions weren't cutting it, what I'd had to rebuild from scratch because nothing off the shelf did what I needed. He'd done his homework. He understood the space. He wasn't performing interest. He was actually interested. By the end of that first meeting, I knew I wanted him on the team. I offered him a senior technical role. He accepted. And because I trusted him, because he was the person who'd sat next to me at my graduation ceremony when nobody from my family showed up, the person who'd asked you came alone, and actually waited for the answer, I gave him something I hadn't given anyone else. Full administrative access to the Sterling Systems server infrastructure. He knew the whole system, every client file, every contract, every data partition, every access credential. If you wanted to understand Sterling Systems completely, not just use it, but see all of it, the architecture, the client relationships, the competitive edge, Dylan could do that from his desk. He was the second person who had ever had that level of visibility into what I'd built. I was the first. I sat him down before I handed over the credentials. I told him what this access meant, what it represented. I told him it wasn't something I gave casually. He looked me in the eye and said he understood. I believed him. That took a long time to stop feeling like a failure of judgment. Around the same time, something else happened. Sterling Systems started getting noticed in the right circles, small features in trade publications, a few referrals from satisfied clients, a growing reputation for clean, reliable work, and that was when Elijah called. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in the middle of reviewing a contract. I remember setting the contract down and staring at his name on my screen for longer than a few seconds. There was no reason to pick up. There was also no real reason not to. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I wanted to hear how he'd spin whatever he was calling about. He was warm, almost aggressively warm. He asked about the company, said he'd been following what I was building, said he was proud of me. The word proud sat in my ear for a second. He'd never said that before, not once in 33 years. I let him talk because I wanted to understand what he actually wanted, and I knew if I interrupted he'd reset the whole approach and I'd have to wait longer to find out. Then he got to the point. He was looking to pivot his word from his current work into something with more momentum, and he thought there might be a way we could collaborate. I asked what he meant by collaborate. He was vague in the way that people are vague when they want something specific but don't want to say it directly. Something about leveraging his network, his business development experience, bringing relationships to the table. I said I appreciated the call. I said the company wasn't in a position for that kind of partnership right now. I kept my voice even. I thanked him. He said he understood. He said the offer stood. He said, "You know how to reach me." I hung up and sat with it for a long minute. Then I opened a new email folder and labeled it Elijah. I copied the call log into a document I kept locked behind a second password. Date, time, summary of what was said, what he asked for, what I said, how he responded when I declined. I don't know exactly why I did it that specifically, that quickly. Instinct, maybe, or just pattern recognition, the brain noticing something the conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. The same instinct that made a 15-year-old boy fold a math certificate and put it in his backpack instead of the trash. 3 weeks later, a potential partner I'd been in talks with for months sent me a short, polite email saying they'd decided to go in a different direction. No specific reason given. The kind of email that's been reviewed by a lawyer before sending. I followed up twice. Got nothing back, not even an automated response. A week after that, a second contact, someone who had been warm and responsive for 2 months, who'd initiated our last 3 conversations, went suddenly cold. 1-word replies, then nothing. I reread our last exchange looking for something I might have said wrong. There was nothing. I didn't connect the dots yet, not fully, but I added both emails to the Elijah folder. Just in case. That's how it always starts. The Fortune 500 contract came through on a Wednesday morning in early March. I remember the exact feeling of opening that email. Not excitement. Exactly, more like the ground becoming solid under my feet for the first time in years. Harwick & Associates, a logistics firm with operations in 9 states, had chosen Sterling Systems for a full infrastructure overhaul. Multi-year contract. Significant money. The kind of client that doesn't just change your revenue, it changes what your company is, who calls you back, what table you get to sit at. I called nobody to celebrate. I closed the laptop, went for a walk around the block, came back, and started building the onboarding framework. That was the version of me that existed then. No announcements, no dinners, just the next thing that needed to be done. The first sign that something was wrong came 6 weeks into the engagement. One of the junior contacts at Harwick, a guy named Marcus, who I'd spoken with twice a week since onboarding, sent me a casual message. The kind you send when you think you're clarifying something that's already been decided, not flagging a crisis. He mentioned that a competitor had reached out to them, offering a comparable service at a lower price point. Standard stuff, he said. Happens all the time. But the competitor seemed to know a lot about the specifics of our engagement. Things that weren't in any public filing, weren't on our website, weren't in any conversation that had happened outside our own systems. He just wanted to flag it, in case it was relevant. I read that message 3 times. Then I set my phone face down on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment. I'd spent 6 years building something that worked. Something clean. I had 11 employees at that point. People who relied on a paycheck I had to make every 2 weeks without fail. The Harwick contract was the thing that made the next 2 years feel real. And now I was sitting here being told that someone knew things they shouldn't know. I made myself breathe. I made myself think clearly instead of fast. Then I went back to the message. The scope of our Harwick engagement was internal, locked in a protected partition on our server. Nobody outside Sterling Systems had access to the details of that contract, not the terms, not the technical specifications, not the client pain points we'd spent 3 weeks mapping out before we even submitted a proposal. Nobody outside Sterling Systems had access. That left inside. I wrote back to Marcus, thanked him for flagging it, told him we'd look into it, kept my typing calm and professional. And then I sat very still for a while and felt the specific kind of cold that comes when the problem you've been quietly watching for turns out to be closer than you were hoping. I did not confront Dylan. I want to be clear about that. I had no proof. I had a competitor who knew things they shouldn't, and I had one person inside my company with access to everything. That's not evidence. That's a short list. And I'd learned a long time ago that acting on a short list without documentation is how you end up losing. So I watched. And I documented. I started keeping a separate log, nothing sophisticated, just a running document I updated every evening before I left the office. Date, contact name, what changed in the pattern of communication, what they said or stopped saying. The difference between a client who's busy and a client who's being pulled in another direction is subtle, but it's there. Shorter replies come first. Then longer gaps. Then the questions stop because someone else is answering them. Over the next 3 weeks, 2 more Harwick contacts went slightly distant, shorter replies, longer gaps, less initiative. One of them mentioned in passing that they'd had another conversation with the competitor. The competitor had referenced a specific technical vulnerability in legacy systems, something we'd identified during our initial audit of Harwick's infrastructure. A finding that had never left our internal report, that had never been discussed outside of Sterling Systems servers. I added everything to a folder I'd started 2 weeks earlier. I didn't call it the Elijah folder. I called it open. Date-stamped every entry. Kept it behind the second password. Then Elijah called again. This time he didn't open with warmth. He didn't ask how I was. He led with business. The way people lead with business when they've decided the social layer is taking too long. He was building out a data services offering, he said. Looking for anchor clients. He'd heard from a mutual contact. He said that Harwick was reconsidering some of their vendor relationships. He wanted to know if there was any flexibility in our arrangement. Any room, now, for a partnership. I asked him how he knew about Harwick. Short pause. Small enough that someone not listening for it might have missed it. He said something about the industry being small, people talking, the usual flow of information. I said I appreciated the call. He said, I really think we could do something good together, Mason. You and me. Think about it. There was something underneath that sentence. Something that wanted me to hear it as an olive branch, as family reaching out, as an older brother trying to connect. I let him think I heard it that way. I'll think about it, I said. I hung up. I didn't think about it. I moved the Elijah folder and the open folder into the same parent directory and labeled it evidence. I sat at my desk for a few minutes after that. Not panicking, not spiraling, just sitting with the shape of what I now understood. The partner contacts going cold, the competitor with internal information, the second call, this one with a direct reference to a client whose name I had never given him. I hadn't spoken to Elijah about Harwick. I hadn't mentioned them to anyone outside the company. That was the moment I knew. Not enough to act on, not yet, not without something solid, but enough to stop being surprised by anything that came next. Enough to start moving carefully instead of just watching. What I couldn't have known from the outside, what I'd only find out later, was that Elijah had been emailing Dylan for weeks. Not through any encrypted channel, not through anything designed to be difficult to trace. He was doing it from his personal Gmail account, the one he'd had since college, the one with his full name in the address. And Dylan was reading those emails and writing back from his work laptop. The laptop issued by Sterling Systems. The laptop whose traffic every page visited, every attachment opened, every file copied or moved was automatically logged, timestamped, and archived by the same server infrastructure that Dylan himself had helped me design 18 months earlier. He knew the system better than anyone. He'd written portions of the logging protocol himself, which means he knew, in theory, that everything on that laptop was on record. He just didn't think anyone would look. Every exchange between them, every instruction Elijah sent, every file Dylan accessed outside of business hours, every timestamp marking the exact second a client record was opened and the IP address it was accessed from, the full routing path of every email Dylan read on that machine, including the sender's domain, the subject line header, and the delivery metadata. All of it was sitting in the logs, growing, waiting. Neither of them thought to check whether the floor they were standing on was recording their footsteps. That's the thing about building a system from the ground up. You know where every wire runs. And you know what happens when someone steps on one. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Olivia Chen. Olivia Chen had been Sterling Systems' outside legal counsel for 3 years. I'd hired her after our second major contract, not because I had any specific legal problem at the time, but because I'd watched too many small companies get gutted by things they hadn't documented properly. Agreements that turned into disputes because nobody had a clean paper trail. I wanted someone who read the fine print before it became a problem. Olivia was the kind of lawyer who made other lawyers careful, sharp, exact, and constitutionally unimpressed by anything that wasn't in writing. When she told you something was fine, it was fine. When she told you to pay attention, you paid attention. She called me on a Thursday afternoon in late spring. Her assistant had reached out first to book 15 minutes. That was unusual. Olivia didn't schedule calls through her assistant unless what she had to say needed framing, unless she wanted me to be sitting down and not distracted when I heard it. I cleared my afternoon and took the call in my office with the door closed. She told me that our annual security audit had flagged some anomalies in the server logs. She'd been copied on the preliminary report from our internal IT team, and she felt I should look at it directly before we decided how to proceed. The anomalies weren't subtle, she said, but she wanted me to see them myself, in my own time, before she put a name to what she was looking at. I asked her to walk me through it. She sent a PDF to my secure inbox while we were still on the phone. 23 pages. I opened it on my second monitor and turned my chair so I could read it properly. The first section was timestamps. Between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. on 14 separate nights over a 6-week period, someone with full administrative credentials had accessed the Harwick client partition. Not browsed, accessed, opened specific files, and in several cases exported them. The exports didn't go to any Sterling Systems endpoint. They resolved to an external IP address registered to a residential location in the same city. I looked at the credential ID attached to every one of those sessions. Dylan's. Olivia gave me a moment. I used it. I'd given him that credential ID myself. I'd sat across from him at my desk, looked him in the eye, and handed it over. I'd told him what it meant. I remember the exact words I used. This is not something I give casually. I stared at his credential on the screen and felt something that I can only describe as the absence of surprise. Not relief, this wasn't relief. Not anger, not yet. It was something colder than anger and quieter than grief. The closest I can get to naming it is this. It was the feeling of a suspicion becoming a fact, and the fact landing in a place in your chest that had already been cleared out, a long time ago, for exactly this. I'd trusted him. I'd made it a point to trust him specifically. And it turned out that the one person who'd been there at the beginning, the one who'd asked if I was okay when nobody else thought to, had been the point of entry for everything that followed. The second section was the email logs. This was the part that required me to set my coffee down and not pick it up again for a long time. When a Sterling Systems employee receives an external email on their work device, the server logs the delivery metadata, sender domain, message header, receive timestamp, device IP. It doesn't read the content. It records the envelope, not the letter. But in this case, the envelope was more than enough. 14 emails from a Gmail account, received over 6 weeks. The sender name in the header, E. Sterling. My brother's initial, my last name. His personal account, the same one he'd used since his first year of college, the one he'd never thought to change because he'd never thought anyone would be looking. 14 emails, received and replied to from Dylan's work laptop, timed across the same period as our Harwick onboarding, across the same weeks that Marcus had noticed a competitor who knew too much. I said nothing for a while. Olivia let me stay quiet. There's more, she said. The third section was the access log for our client master database. That's the file that holds the full contract terms, pricing structures, and technical vulnerability reports for every active engagement we have. It's the most sensitive document on our system. In a normal week, under normal work conditions, it gets accessed maybe 3 times. Over that same 6-week window, Dylan's credential had opened that file 41 times. 41. I read that number twice to make sure I hadn't misread a digit. Olivia had already run the cross-reference. 6 of those 41 access events occurred within 4 minutes of receiving an email from E. Sterling. Someone was sending requests through a Gmail account. Someone inside my company was receiving those requests on a work laptop, pulling the files, and sending them out. They'd been doing it for 6 weeks. They'd done it on weeknights, on weekends, twice after midnight. They had used the infrastructure I built to dismantle what I built. I closed the PDF. I sat for a moment. I opened it again. "Olivia," I said, "what do we need for a cease and desist?" She didn't pause. "I already started the draft. I just needed to know you'd seen what I was looking at." We spent 2 hours on the phone. By the time we hung up, the C&D was structured and the evidence package was formalized. The server logs with exact timestamps and credential IDs, the email metadata headers documenting the full communication chain between Elijah's Gmail account and Dylan's work device, the access frequency report showing 41 hits on the client master database, and the export records with the residential IP address the files had been sent to. IP theft, breach of fiduciary duty, both civil, both documented, both airtight. Olivia would have the C&D signed within 72 hours. She told me employment action, meaning Dylan, should happen first, before the C&D landed on Elijah, to prevent any coordination of a counter-narrative. I told her to schedule it. Dylan's termination happened the following Tuesday. I did it myself. I didn't send HR. I didn't delegate it to Olivia. I sat him down in the conference room, just the two of us, door closed, and I told him what we'd found. I showed him the access log. I showed him the email metadata. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask him to explain. I just put the documents on the table and let him read. He didn't deny it. He went very quiet, and then he said he was sorry. I told him there'd be a box for his things in the lobby and 30 minutes to clear it. That was the entire conversation. Before Olivia hung up after our earlier call, she said, "You handled this right. Most people react. You waited and documented. That's the difference between having a case and having a conversation." I didn't say anything to that. I just wrote down the date and time the C&D would be delivered. Then I got up, went to the filing cabinet, and pulled out a white envelope from a box in the bottom drawer, thick stock, standard business size, nothing special about it except what I was about to put inside. I printed the full documentation package. I printed the email header metadata with E. Sterling's name visible in the sender field. I printed the 41-entry access log with the 6 timestamp matches highlighted. I printed the export records. I printed the C&D, signed and dated. I put all of it in the envelope and sealed it. Then I held it for a moment, just held it. I thought about the kitchen counter with the math certificate on it. I thought about the birthday cake nobody sang for properly. I thought about the moment I handed Dylan a credential ID and told him it wasn't something I gave casually. I thought about how long I'd been careful, how many years of documentation and timestamping and quiet, methodical work it had taken to arrive at this exact moment with this exact piece of paper in my hand. 15 years of being invisible. 3 years of building something that worked. 6 weeks of watching it get picked apart by the 2 people I'd chosen, out of everyone, to trust. And now it was all in one envelope. I opened my calendar. I found the date of the annual Sterling Foundation Gala, our own event, our room, our guest list. I added one name, Elijah Sterling. He was going to walk in. He was going to think he was there to reconnect, or to perform, or to take inventory of what I had that he wanted. He was going to be confident, because he always was. And I was going to let him get comfortable first. The gala was held on the second Friday of November. Sterling Foundation hosted it every year, a fundraiser for digital literacy programs in underfunded schools, which was something I'd started 4 years ago when the company had enough margin to give something back. The venue was a ballroom on the 14th floor of a building downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows, city lights below. Catering from a restaurant I'd taken my first major client to, years ago, when the meal had been a stretch. I'd been in that room 100 times for planning meetings and set up walkthroughs. I knew every corner of it. I arrived early and stood near the back bar while the room filled. Black tie, 230 guests, investors, clients, partners, people whose work intersected with ours. Olivia was already there, near the entrance, in a dark blazer, holding a glass of water she hadn't touched. We'd spoken that morning. She knew what tonight was. She didn't need instructions. The white envelope was in my inside jacket pocket. I watched the room build. I made small talk with a senior partner from one of our client firms. I accepted a drink I didn't finish. I kept one eye on the entrance. At 8:14, Elijah walked in, He was wearing a suit I didn't recognize, newer than anything I'd seen him in before, which told me something about how he'd decided to present himself tonight. He came in alone, checked his coat, and stood for a moment just inside the entrance with the particular stillness of someone who wants to be seen standing still, looking at ease, surveying. He did what he always did in a new room, took inventory. His eyes moved across the crowd the way a contractor scans a job site, not admiring it, assessing it, finding the load-bearing walls, identifying what was useful and what could be moved. Then he spotted me. He smiled. Not a small smile. The full one. The one that had been charming people since he was 19 and had never once meant what it looked like. He moved through the crowd toward me, stopping twice to introduce himself to people in his path, people who were my clients, my partners, people who had no idea who he was, with the ease of someone who assumed that being in the room was the same as belonging to it. Mason. He extended his hand. This is incredible. All of this. I shook it. Glad you could make it. I mean it, he said, looking around. You built something real here. I let that sit for a second. He moved into it like he'd been rehearsing. He started talking about the room, about the foundation, about how impressive it was to see what I'd done. He told me I should be proud, that this was exactly the kind of thing he'd always known I could build. I noticed, he said, always. I let that go. He mentioned, with the casualness of someone dropping a fact they think you don't know, that he'd been talking to a few people in the data infrastructure space lately, building some partnerships, and that there was a lot of movement in the sector. He said the word sector twice. I nodded. I let him talk. A few people drifted into our orbit: one of my senior partners, a board member from a client firm, 2 investors I'd worked with for years. Elijah widened his presence the way he always did. He made eye contact, asked questions, inserted himself into the conversation with the kind of smooth confidence that registers as belonging before anyone's thought to ask whether it's earned. He said something that made the group laugh. He mentioned again his work in the data services space. He was performing, and the audience was watching. I waited until the moment felt full. Then I said, Elijah, I want to introduce you to someone. I caught Olivia's eye across the room. She walked over. This is Olivia Chen, I said. She's the lead counsel for Sterling Systems. Elijah put his hand out. Great to meet you. Mason never mentioned he had such a sharp team. Olivia shook his hand. She said, the cease and desist was delivered to your home address 3 days ago. Everything in that envelope is already on record. The smile didn't leave his face immediately. That's the thing I remember most. There was a half-second where his expression continued performing while the rest of him processed what he just heard. Then the smile went still, not gone, just frozen, like a screen that stopped refreshing. I reached into my jacket and placed the white envelope on the cocktail table between us. He looked at it. He looked at me. He looked at Olivia. This is a family matter, he said. His voice was lower than it had been 10 seconds ago. Still controlled, but lower. Olivia said, it stopped being a family matter when you accessed our servers. The group around us had gone quiet. I don't know exactly when it happened, somewhere between Olivia's first sentence and Elijah's response. The conversation in our immediate vicinity had tapered off completely, not abruptly. The way sound leaves a room slowly and then all at once. The people nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. One of the investors I'd worked with for 3 years took a small step back, just enough to create distance, not enough to be obvious about it. Someone 3 feet to my left reached slowly into their pocket. I didn't need to look to know why. Elijah tried once more. He looked at me directly. Whatever this is, we can handle it privately. Between us. I said, we are handling it. This is exactly how. He held eye contact with me for a moment. I think he was looking for something: hesitation, or guilt, or the version of me who spent 33 years waiting for people to look his way. He didn't find it. That version wasn't in the room tonight. His eyes moved to the group around us, to Olivia, to the envelope sitting on the cocktail table between us, then to the board member, then to the 2 investors. He was doing the math, looking for one face that would give him something to work with, one expression that might shift toward him. There wasn't one. The board member from one of our client firms said, quietly, to the person next to him, what's in the envelope? It wasn't directed at Elijah. It didn't need to be. The question was in the air now, And everybody in that circle was looking at the same thing: a white envelope on a cocktail table and a man who had just been told, in front of witnesses, that a legal document had been delivered to his home. Elijah had no answer to that, not one that helped him. 2 of the event's security staff appeared within 4 minutes. I hadn't called them. Olivia had a quiet word to the venue manager earlier in the evening, a contingency she'd arranged without being asked because that was how she operated. She'd told them there might be a situation, that if it arose she'd give them a signal, and that the guest in question would need to be escorted to the exit. Professionally, she'd said. No scene. They were professional. They flanked Elijah from either side and spoke to him in a tone low enough that only the people closest could hear. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched him look once more at the group around him, at the board member, at the investors, at the people he'd been charming 20 minutes ago, and find nothing. Not one face that was willing to be his ally in that moment. He left with them. He didn't make a scene. I think some part of him understood that making a scene would cost him the last small thing he had left, which was the ability to walk out of the room under his own power. So he went quietly. The 2 security staff moved at a pace that was just fast enough to be directional and just slow enough to look voluntary. The room watched him go in the particular silence that follows something no one was expecting to see. Not a dramatic silence, not gasps, not pointed fingers. Just the held breath quality of 200 people recalibrating what kind of event they were at. Then the conversation started again. Quietly, at first a word here, a question there, and then faster. By the time I moved away from the cocktail table, the name Elijah Sterling was already moving through the room in the way that names move when they've become a story. I shook a few hands. I thanked Olivia, who gave me a single nod that said everything that needed to be said. I left before 11. I slept 8 hours that night, the first time in months. Dylan had been terminated the week before the gala. What happened to him afterward wasn't my concern. It wasn't a criminal matter, and I had no interest in pursuing it beyond what the civil documentation required. He'd been given the terms. He'd signed what he needed to sign. He was gone. Elijah's situation moved on its own timeline, the way civil processes do. The C&D landed 3 days before the gala, as planned. Elijah had been in breach from the moment it was delivered. He'd attended the gala anyway, introduced himself to my clients, referenced his work in data services in a room full of witnesses. The documentation from that evening alone was a supplement to the original filing. After the gala, his position changed quickly. The professional networks in our sector are smaller than people outside them assume. The story of what happened in that ballroom, a cease and desist, a woman named Olivia Chen, and a man who said it was a family matter, reached people who did business in that space within days. The partners he'd been cultivating in his data services venture had questions he couldn't answer cleanly. His explanation for why a law firm representing Sterling Systems had named him in a C&D for IP theft required a counter-narrative he hadn't prepared. 2 of his existing arrangements dissolved within 6 weeks of the gala. A third followed 2 months after that. He filed for bankruptcy 8 months later. The filing was public record, the way these things are. I didn't go looking for it. It found its way to me the way information does when you're the person someone wronged. I didn't find out from him. I found out from a legal notification that came through Olivia's office, a standard procedural update, the kind that gets generated automatically when someone who's been served a C&D enters bankruptcy proceedings, because insolvency affects the standing of a civil claim. It arrived in an email on a Tuesday morning, 3 lines, no subject line drama. Olivia had already annotated it. For your records, no action required from you at this time. I read it once. I understood what it meant, that the thing he'd built to replace what he'd tried to steal had collapsed under its own weight, without any further action from me. I filed the notification in the evidence folder and went back to my morning. My parents called the week after the bankruptcy filing. My mother first, then my father the following day. I knew what the calls were about before I picked up either of them. They weren't calling to acknowledge what had happened. They weren't calling to say they'd heard, or to ask whether I was all right, or to say anything that acknowledged any of the 15 years that had come before this. They were calling because Elijah was in trouble and I was the only person in the family with resources, and in their logic, the same logic that had organized every dinner table, every birthday, every conversation that moved on before I finished my sentence. The strong one was responsible for the struggling one. The terms of how the struggling started were not part of the equation. I let my mother's call ring out. I watched her name on the screen until it went to voicemail. The little notification appeared. I didn't tap it. I put my phone face down and went back to what I was doing. My father called the next day. His name appeared and I watched it. It rang 7 times. I put the phone on the desk and sat with my hands still until the screen went dark. I wasn't angry. That's the thing I want to be precise about. Anger would have required me to still care about how they saw me, to still need something from them that they'd never delivered. I didn't. The line between those two things is where peace lives, and I'd been building toward that line for a long time without always having a name for it. What I felt, watching those calls ring out, was closer to the feeling you get at the end of a very long book. Something that had taken years. That had cost something real. That you were glad you'd read. That was now finished. I didn't call either of them back. I closed both notifications, cleared them from my screen, and I never opened either of them. Sterling Systems had its best revenue quarter on record that same month. 12 new client contracts, 3 enterprise-level renewals. A team of 41 people, all of them hired based on what they could do, all of them paid on time, none of them handed anything they hadn't earned. The same number, I noticed, as the access log entries from Dylan's credential. I sat with that for a moment. 41. The count that had documented the theft and the count that was now building the company, landing in the same number by coincidence or by something that felt like a closed loop. Then I let it go and moved on to the next thing. The empire in the shadows wasn't in the shadows anymore. It had never needed to be. That was just what it looked like from the outside when you were building something that nobody around you believed in yet. It was just a company. A good one. Mine. The morning after the gala, I woke up at 6:15. No alarm. I just woke up, the way you sometimes do when something that has been sitting on your chest for a long time isn't there anymore. I made coffee. Real coffee, from the machine that takes 3 minutes and makes noise like it's trying to prove something. I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and let it cool slightly before I drank it. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always does, traffic building slowly, the early light coming in low and flat over the buildings across the street. Normal, unremarkable. Mine. I opened my laptop. I had 17 unread emails, which was about average for a Thursday morning. I worked through them in order. A client question about an upcoming infrastructure review, a scheduling request from a new hire, a billing confirmation from our primary vendor. Normal work. The kind of work that the company now generated on its own, without me having to force every piece of it into existence. I didn't think about Elijah that morning. I want to be accurate about that. He didn't cross my mind at breakfast, or during the emails, or during the call I had at 9 with one of our enterprise clients. If someone had asked me, mid-morning, what I was thinking about, the answer would have been the Q4 infrastructure review, the new hires onboarding schedule, whether the espresso machine in the break room was still making that sound. Not him. Not any of them. That was how I knew it was over. Not the gala. Not the C&D. Not watching him walk out of my room. It was a Thursday morning where I simply did not think about any of it, and didn't notice until the afternoon. I'd spent years building something real. I'd spent years making sure I could prove what happened, because I'd known since I was 15 years old that proof was the only thing nobody could argue with. I'd protected what I built not by fighting, not by confronting, not by making speeches at dinner tables, by documenting, by waiting, by staying in the room until I owned it. That's not a tactic. That's just what happens when you stop waiting for people to see you and start building things that can't be ignored. I don't have a lesson for you. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your own Elijah, or your own Dylan, or your own birthday party that became someone else's announcement. Those are yours. What I can tell you is what I know from the other side of it. It gets quiet. Not immediately, and not all at once. But eventually it gets very quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't emptiness, that isn't absence. And in that quiet, if you've done the work and waited long enough and kept the right records, there's something waiting on the other side that feels a lot like peace. The last time I saw Elijah, he was being escorted out of my gala. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. We were finally equal, I just happened to own the building.